All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Chashvan, Stephen Terry Zinn, for dedicating all the Shomer Drashos this month. Ari, thank you so much. In memory of Steve's father, Bonim Tzvi Ben Chaim, on the occasion of his 18th yard site. Lay a soul as a schosser of Fushlim for our daughter Ilana Bas Esther, and for all of those wounded in Eretz Yisrael. Yonasan and Rachel Wolf for a complete and lasting refuah for a Fa'al Yitzchak Baruch Ben Esther. Jerry and Sarah Wolaski in the schosser of Fushlim for Zechariah Dov Ben Peral Shira. Ed, Israel, and Iris Miller in the schosser of the Holy Soldiers of the IDF. And the amount of our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael, and our week of learning sponsors, anonymous sponsor, in honor of Yoni Frager's birthday. With that, let us begin. All right, we'll say today's daf is Ayin Dal, 74. And we are picking up in Miras Hashem on Ayin Gimel Amud Beis 73b. So we left off with the statement of Rav Chisda that there are three people who are. Well, actually, let's just pick up with it. Amar Rav Chisda. So we'll say it is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, about 25 lines up from the bottom. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Chisda, Shlosha ne'emanim la'alter. There are three people who are believed immediately. And I'll say what this really means is as follows. There are three people who, when they provide clarification of reality, clarification of circumstances, they are believed to provide that clarification, provided that they go ahead and they clarify the situation immediately. Who are these people? Elohim Asufi. Shabbos say the first is the Asufi. Now remember, this reference is back to yesterday's Gemara. What did we see in yesterday's Gemara? That if you find an Asufi in the Shuk, and two people step forward and they say, by the way, that's our child. What's the halacha? Now, again, to be clear, they're not asking for the child back. That's not what they're doing. What are they doing? They're providing testimony about the yichus of the child. So we believe them. When do we believe them? As long as the baby has not left the shuk, the marketplace. That's what it means la'alter. Next, chaya. Sorry, actually, before we explain it. So chaya, a midwife, upoteres chavrosel, and a woman who exempts her friends. All right, what are the cases? So Asufi Adamra, so the Asufi case, as we just mentioned. Chaya, what's the case of the midwife? This is actually very interesting. Disanya, Chaya ne'emenes lomar ze yotza rishon v'ze yotza sheni. Suppose to imagine for a moment a woman gives birth to twins, right? Reuven's married to Rachel. Rachel Baruch Hashem gives birth to twin boys. And what happens? Again, one of them is the Bechar, one of them is not. Now, obviously, Abosai, it's not just semantics, right? Remember again, the Bechar is entitled to Pishnayim, double portion. So now what's the issue? In all of the excitement, no one knows which baby came out first, which baby was born first. So the midwife is believed to say, this is the Bechar, this is not the Bechar. She's believed to say that. When is that true, that she is believed? Shelo yatzesa v'chazra. She's only believed, Rabbi say, if she hasn't left the room. Aval yatzesa v'chazra, but I will say, if halacha l'maisa, she left the room and then returned, ina ne'emenes. Ultimately, again, she is not believed. She's not believed. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, huchseka al omda. Rabbi Eliezer says, it's only, I will say, when she is muchsak. If you take a look at Rashi says, let's just say it outside. Huchseka v'amda means that halacha l'maisa, she never turned her face away. So the Gemara says, "Ve'im lav, but if not, she's not believed." My ben, I was supposed to say they sound like the same thing. What's the difference between not leaving the room and not turning your face away? Very simple. Ika benayu da'ahader apa. We will say no. You could have a case where she stayed in the room, but what? She turned away. So it's a machlokes, again, what exactly she needs in order to maintain her credibility. Is it that she has to have eyes on the babies the whole time? Or it's that she was present in the room the whole time. Okay, but point over here is that the chaya, that the midwife is believed to clarify the circumstances. Poteres chavrosea mahi. What's the case of a woman who exempts her friends? What's that scenario? So the Gemara says, Disnan, shalosh nashim shayu shenos b'mita achos. So we'll say if there are three women sleeping in one bed together, v'nimtza dam achos tachas achas man. We'll say there is a stain of blood that's found underneath one of them. So we'll say, so now what's the question? What's the issue? The issue is, are they a nida? Right? What's the nida status? What's the halacha? Kulan tmeos. Ultimately, again, they're all presumed to be a nida. But ka'achas mehem v'nimseis tmea. If halacha l'mayis, again, one of them did a b'dika, and it turned out that she, in fact, is tmea, she's a nida. So what's the halacha? He tmea v'kulan tahoros. Then she is the one who is the nida, and the rest of them are tahoros. So we'll say, so that's what it means when it says that one woman could exempt her friends. Rav Chisda shebad ka'asma kashir vesas. Rav Chisda says that's only true when she checked herself, she examined herself immediately after seeing the stain. So only if there's a sense of immediacy, then ultimately, again, the stain could be attributed to her. Incredible. Tarabaram. So we'll say, let's go back to Yichus. Ne'emenes chayalomer. And we'll say, now that we brought up the midwife case, the Gemara brings up another interesting example of this. So the Gemara says, Ne'emenes chayalomar, a midwife is believed to say, Zeh Kohen, v'zeh Levi, Zeh Nosen, v'zeh Mamzer. So we'll say, so now imagine for a moment, a woman is a midwife delivering multiple babies. So right, you have all of these women coming in to give birth. Now again, one of them is married to a Yisrael, one of them is married to a Kohen, a Levi, a Yisrael, a Mamzer. So now the babies are born. Baruch Hashem, they're all in the nursery. So now the Chaya, the midwife, is believed to say, okay, this is the Yisrael, this is the Kohen, this is the Levi, this is the Mamzer. When is that so? Shalakara aleh Hashem irer. They will say that's when there's no confusion about the identity of the babies. Take a look at the first wide line in Rashi. Shalakara aleh irer, shalo yatzem urar al havlad lomar zebina shal isha es Mamzer. So I will say, all of this is assuming she's permitted to clarify this in a situation where no one is voicing any type of machlokes about the identity of the kids. So assuming that that there's no machlokes, she is permitted to go ahead and say, by the way, this kid is this kid is this kid is this. Aval kar Hashem irer. But once again, there's some level of machlokes, eina ne'emenes. Ultimately, again, she is not believed. To which the Gemara says, when you say machlokes, irer demai, so who's voicing machlokes, or who's voicing an issue? So the Gemara says, irer demai, ilema irer chad. If you say that there's an eid echad who's claiming, no, that boy is not the Kohen, he's the Mamzer. So vaha am Rabbi Yochanan ein irer pachos mishtayim. Rabbi Yochanan said in general, irer Rabbi say like any type of irer meaning machlokes or debate about identity is not relevant if it comes from less than two witnesses. Ela ir trey. Rather, you have to say that lamais we're talking about where two witnesses come forward and voice some doubt about the identity of the child. By saying the other possibility is the olam emelacha ir erchad. Maybe it's really Eid Echad who's coming along and raising doubt about the identity of the child. Rabbi Yochanan said that there's no error with less than two. That's only when there is an established sense of kashrus. In other words, Rabbi will say, if somebody has a cheskes kashrus, and now someone else wants to come to erode that cheskes kashrus, that could work, but that can't work with less than two witnesses. To which the Gemara says, but in a case where there is not an established cheskes kashrus, like for example, in this scenario over here, right? Why is there no established cheskes kashrus over here? Because the babies were just born, right? And it's not like we have solidified identities, that we know for sure this is this kid, mother's kid, this is this. So when you don't have a cheskes kashrus, even irur dechad, even doubt cast by an eid echad, ultimately again could be relevant. Okay, now other examples of this. Some just interesting cases. Essentially, now that we brought up the topic of doubt about what to do in cases of doubt, so the Gemara brings up other examples of doubt. So listen to this. Ne'eman bal bekach. Ne'eman bal mekach lomar. So we'll say, imagine the following situation. Ruvain is selling an object. So Ruvain is believed to say, Lezeh macharti ulezeh ein macharti. So Ruvain is believed to say, I sold the object to Shimon and not to Levi. And not to Levi. Right? The idea, look at Rashi, just a bit of context on this case. Rashi is 4 lines up from the bottom. Lezeh macharti im shnai ma'orin ala mekach, zeh omer macharta li, v'zeh omer li macharta, v'shali ha-mekach. So I both say the case over here is Ruvain has an object, and what's happening over here is Shimon's claiming Ruvain sold it to me, and Levi's claiming Ruvain sold it to me. So there's a machlokes, ultimately both sides claiming that Ruvain sold the object to them. So what do we do in a case like this? So Naaman bala mekach lomar, so Ruvain, the seller, is believed to say, Lezeh macharti ulezeh ein macharti. I sold it to Shimon, I didn't sell it to Levi. So the Gemara says, what's the case? What's the case you're talking about over here? So listen to this. The Gemara says, when is this true? When Ruvain himself is still in possession of the item. So in other words, if Ruvain is in possession of the item, and what happens? There's a machlokes, right? Shimon says, you sold it to me. And Levi says, no, you sold it to me. So Ruvain, assuming that he is in possession of the item, is believed to say, I sold it to Shimon. He's believed to say, I sold it to Shimon. Aval inecho biyado, but Rabbi say, if halacha l'maisa, Ruvain no longer has the object in his hand, then Eino ne'eman, then he is not believed. Now, I will say, now, what's the logic of that? Why is he not believed if the object is no longer in his hands? So take a look at Rashi. It's actually quite interesting. Last Rashi on the page, Aval bizman she'im mecho biyado, u'shneim ochsin bo. Now, I will say, now, the case over here is, if you can imagine, so here's the scenario. Shimon and Levi are both holding on to the object. Shimon saying it's mine, right? Levi saying it's mine. So now, again, so halacha, so what are we saying? So now Ruvain steps in, and Ruvain says, I'm going to tell you. So the Gemara says, if Ruvain's still holding the object, then Ruvain is believed to clarify ultimately who the owner of the object is, who he sold it to. But if he's no longer holding it, and Shimon and Levi are in this tug of war, Ruvain doesn't really have credibility to say who he sold it to. Now, why not? Rashi says it's fascinating. Eino ne'eman, dechevan dalav ale ramya sulo daik liskar lemihu. Now, we'll say, the Gemara makes an assumption. People only remember things that are important. Right? Things that are not important and not important as defined do not have a direct bearing on my life. I don't remember. I don't remember. So therefore, again, the Gemara acts like this. Once Ruvain sells the object, Rabbi say, and he hands it over, he doesn't care who he sold it to, right? What matters? He sold it. It's done. So Rabbi say, so therefore, again, once the object leaves his hands, he doesn't necessarily have the same level of credibility to say, I sold it to this one, didn't sell it to this one. So it's fascinating. He's just not on his mind. So the Gemara says, if he's still holding it, so ultimately, again, he's believed. He has credibility to say, I sold it to Shimon. Once it's no longer in his hands, and Shimon and Levi are in this tug of war over it, Ruvain doesn't have credibility to weigh in. Abba say, top of Ayin Daled, 74a, I asks the Gemara, V'nechse zuzi miman nukit. I don't understand. Why is this a case of doubt? We'll say it's very simple. Why don't we say, Ruvain, who did you receive money from? And whoever you received money from, that's the purchaser. He received money from both of them. And I will say what happened. Ruvain says, here's what I remember. One of them gave me the money, so to speak, with my consent, and one of them forced the money upon me. Right? Velo yadia hey midato, v'hei lo midato. I don't remember who was who. So therefore I will say again, he actually did receive money from both of them. But again, one was because Ruvain was willingly selling him the item, and the other one was like just kind of giving him the money in a forced way because he wanted the object. Okay, so I will say, so therefore so just another case of credibility. So therefore Ruvain the seller is ultimately again believed to go ahead and say, I sold the object to Shimon, but only if Ruvain the seller himself is still holding on to the object. Next case. Ne'eman, that was Ayin Daled 74, 3 lines down, last word on the line. Ne'eman dayin lomar, lezeh zachisi ulezeh chiyafti. A judge is believed to say, I exonerated this individual, and ultimately again found this other individual liable. So a judge after the fact is believed to tell us who is guilty, who is innocent. When is that so? The Gemara says, dinin omdin lefanov. That's only when the litigants are still standing before the judge. But if the litigants are no longer there, Eino ne'aman. Ultimately, again, the judge is not believed. Now I'll say again, what's the logic? Same idea. When the litigants are in the presence of the judge, so then ultimately, again, the judge has an obligation. That's Rami alei de inshi. It's on his mind, and therefore he has an obligation to go ahead and sort out who's who. Once they leave his courtroom, then Lamaisa, again, it's not something that's on his mind. Not something that's on his mind. So therefore, Rabbi say he doesn't have credibility. The Gemara says, I don't understand. The nechse zechusa man nakim, man nakit. Rabbi say again, courts commit their rulings to writing. So why don't you look at the written verdict and see who's guilty, who's innocent? Lo tzricha dekriya zechusayhu. What happened? The document was torn up. So because the document was torn up, we don't know ultimately again who is liable and who is innocent. To which the Gemara says, v'neheder v'naydininu. Maybe Rabbi say we should obligate them in a retrial, right? In other words, so look, if at the end of the day we don't have a document, right, ascertaining who is guilty, who is innocent, right, and again the litigants are arguing about who's guilty, who's innocent. Maybe we should just retry the entire thing. So it's actually quite interesting. Beshuda de daini. What are we talking about over here? We're going to say Shuda de daini is what we would call judicial discretion. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. It's almost right across in Rashi. Beshuda de daini. Bedin she'eno taloi betam ela hakol befiv shal dayin ka'iv iksuvis damar nichse l'tuvia. So listen to this. There are different ways that judges adjudicate cases. So sometimes halacha l'maisa, a judge will go ahead and adjudicate a case based on fact, right? And ultimately, again, go ahead and say this one's chayiv and this one's zakai. Then there are other times we'll say where sometimes judges have to go ahead and just make a call. What is the call based on? The call is not necessarily based on evidence. What is it based on? Feeling. Now, it's not just stam feeling. It's based on feeling, or it's feeling that's informed by evidence of some sort, but it's not clear cut. And again, a Beis is empowered to do this. So if you remember again, so Rashi over here quotes the Gemara we had in Ksuvis, where a guy made a statement, all of my property goes to Tuvia. And what happens, as one could imagine, two guys named Tuvia show up. So Beis has to try to figure out, so what are they going to do? Based on their research, they're going to try to figure out which Tuvia do we think he's referring to. Do they know for sure at the end of the day which Tuvia he's referring to? No, because Lamaisa, again, it's not explicit. There's two Tuvias. Salocha Lamaisa, again, it's called Shuda Daini. So we'll say, you can't force a retrial in a Shuda Daini. Why not? Because since at the end of the day this was based on judicial discretion, it's interesting. There's no guarantee that if they were to retry it, that they would come out with the same verdict. So therefore, there's no benefit to going ahead and retrying it. Okay, let's go back to Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says as follows. We'll say now, remember again, just to point out, why are we doing all of these cases? They're all interesting, but why are we doing them now? This is all the ne'emanos motif, all of the credibility motif. We got started with this ultimately again by the Asufi, by telling us that if you find a baby in the shuk, and then a man and a woman step forward and say, we are the parents of this Asufi, they have credibility as long as the baby has not yet been removed from the shuk. We then went from there to talk about the credibility in a variety of different cases, most notably of a midwife to identify the children. And now we're just giving other cases of credibility. Amar Rav Nachman, Shlosha ne'amanan ala bachar. There are three people who are believed when it comes to the status of a bachar. So we'll say three people who are believed to go ahead and say, this child is a bachar. Eluhain. These are the people who have credibility. Chaya, a midwife. Aviv v'imo, father and mother. So we'll say, so again, and each of them have a different window of credibility. Chaya, the midwife, la'alter. So we'll say that we already said before, right? So the midwife is believed to go ahead and tell us the identity of the child, but only immediately. So remember again, we'll say back to Amud Beis, get a machlokes, what's immediately? Immediately, maybe as long as she hasn't left the room, or other possibility is she hasn't turned away. Okay, but that's her window. Imo, kol shiva, The mother has credibility to say that this is the Bechar, ultimately, again, for the first 7 days of the baby's life, i.e., up until the bris milah. Now, why 7 days? Look at Rashi. It's actually interesting. Kol Shiva. Shadayin ein aviv makir bo. Shlo yatsa mitachas yedei imo likanis labris. So we'll say it was customary for the first 7 days, the father wasn't really as involved with the child. In other words, the child was with the mother. Child baby was with the mother. So the mother is caring for the child. So therefore, again, the mother has credibility for 7 days. However, again, the Gemara says, good. I'm sorry. Imo kol shiva, aviv li'olam. Ultimately, again, we'll say father, li'olam, forever. Now, the truth is forever really means really from the day of the bris milah and on, right? Or it could also mean the entire time. But lamaisa, what it means is going forward, right? The olam forever, from the bris milah and on. Now, we'll say, now what's the logic behind that? The logic behind that, at the end of the day, is that halacha lamaisa, the father has a vested interest in making sure that he knows which son is his bechar, because this is going to be the primary inheritor. Kiddushin, as we learned, yakir yakirenu la'achirim. So we'll say the pasuk says, right? Ki es bechar ben asnua yakir. Remember, this is by the Parshas Ki Seitze. So this is, the father has an obligation to recognize the identity of his bechar, yakirenu la'achirim, and he has an obligation ultimately again to make the identity of his bechar known to others as well. Mikan Am Rabbi Yehuda ne'eman adam lomer ze b'ni bechar. Rabbi Yehuda says that a man is believed to say, "This is my bechar." So I will say, a father is always believed to say, "This son is my bechar." Ukashim shne'eman lomar ze b'ni bechar, and this means that a father is believed to say, "This is my bechar." Kach ne'eman lomar ze ben grusha v'ze ben chalutza. So I will say, this is fascinating. The same way that a father is believed to go ahead and testify regarding the status of a son as a bechar, he's also believed to testify regarding the status of his son as a ben grusha or ben chalutza. Very interesting, right? So in other words, let's say again, a father comes forward one day and says, "You know what? Right? Reuven and Shimon, these are my sons, but Reuven's my son. His mother was a grusha. I'm a Kohen, his mother was a grusha." So again, Rabbi Yehuda is equating the two sides of the same coin. The same father that is believed to say, "My son is a bechar," is also believed to say, "My son is a ben grusha, ben chalutza." The Chum say, "Eino ne'aman." No. Chum say, a father is believed to say that his son is a bechar, because ultimately, again, that's a biblical right. But a father is not believed to say that his son is a ben grusha or ben chalutza. And I will say, just to illustrate this, if you can imagine again, Reuven's on his deathbed. Reuven's a Kohen, right? And on his deathbed, he calls in his children, right? And he says to one of his sons, "By the way, I never told you this. I'm a Kohen, but I told you. I'm a Kohen, but your mother is a grusha, or your mother was married before." So halacha l'maaseh, interestingly enough, the Gemara says we don't believe him. We don't believe him. We believe him essentially in order to elevate the status of a child as a bechar, but we do not believe him in order to compromise the status of a child and make him into a ben grusha, ben chalutza. Very important halacha. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Abba Shaul hayakar l'shtuki beduki. So remember again, Abba Shaul used to call a shtuki a beduki. So the Gemara says, okay, my beduki, what does that mean? What does that mean that we call him beduki? Ilay Moshe Botkin es imo va'omeres lekasher nivalti ne'emenes. So we'll say, maybe beduki. Now remember, who's the shtuki? The shtuki, the Gemara says, is the child who we know his mother, but we don't know his father, right? Shtuki, whenever he says, "Hey, Dad," his mother's like, "Shh," right? No, not him. Right? So Lamaisa, the Gemara says, so now Abba Shaul's calling a shtuki a beduki. Now we'll say beduki, baduk, means like investigation of some sort. So what's going on over here? So the Gemara says, what's the beduki? Maybe it means that when we go over to the mother and we investigate the mother, or we ask the mother a series of questions. What do we ask her? So we'll say, essentially what we ask her is, tell us, who is the father of the child? And again, if you don't want to divulge the identity of the father of the child, we don't really care who the actual father is. What we do care about, we care of course, but halachically what we care about is he genealogically fit? In other words, was he kosher? Was he kosher? So we check him, and so we ask her, and she says, "L'kasher nevalti ne'emenes." She's believed. She's believed. So if a woman goes ahead and says, "I'm not divulging the identity of the father, but I'm just telling you that he's genealogically fit," she is believed. So we'll say, "Kiman, Whose opinion does this reflect? Rabbi Gamliel. This is like Rabbi Gamliel. To which the Gemara says, but one second, Tanina Chadazimna. We already learned this. Where do we learn this? This nan. Interesting case. Haisam uberes. So we'll say, let's say a woman is pregnant. Now we'll say, now the truth is, this works best in the case of a single woman who is pregnant. And we say to her, Va'amrullah, Mativo shel uberzeh. And we ask her, tell us literally what is the nature of this fetus. Which I will say means, who's the father? Who's the father? And what happens? So let's say she says, oh, the father of the baby, he's a Kohen. He's a Kohen, right? Ish ploni so-and-so is a Kohen. Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar, Omrim ne'emes. Rabbi Elazar says, she's believed. She's believed. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, Lo mi pi anu chayim. Rabbi Yoshua says, absolutely not. We do, literally, again, we don't live based on her mouth, which is another way of saying that she doesn't have just the right to go ahead, or the credibility just to say that the baby is a Kohen, and so is the father. So, I'm Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, halacha Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Yehuda name is Shmuel, that halacha Rabbi Gamliel, namely that she is believed. She is believed. She is absolutely ne'emenes. She is ne'emenes. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. So now, essentially what the Gemara is asking is like this. The Gemara is saying, you're telling me now that when the Mishnah says that Abba Shaul says that a shtuki is a beduki, what that means is, we go to the mother, we ask her, who's the father? And as long as she tells us that the father is a kosher, right, he's genealogically fit, we believe her. So essentially, what you're telling me is, a woman is believed to tell us who the father of her baby is. So Gemara says, okay, we already learned that before. That's Rabbi Gamliel. Right? Rabbi Gamliel says, a woman is pregnant. She says, the father of my child is a Kohen. What do we say? What do we say? Okay. So we already learned that before. Why does our Mishnah have to restate it? To which the Gemara says, you're right. Chad lahach shirba, v'chad lahach shirbebita. So this is interesting. One is to go ahead and tell us about the kashrus of the woman, and one is to tell us about the kashrus of the offspring. So you both say, watch what's happening over here. Well, unless you have a single woman who becomes pregnant, there's two issues really at play over here. Number one, she herself, the woman herself, is she permitted to marry into the kahuna? Right? Because we'll say, for example, a woman who has relations with a man who is apostle can't marry a Kohen. So the shaila number one is she herself fit for the kahuna? And what's the status of her offspring? There's two different questions. In other words, obviously they're interrelated, right? But lamaisa, so therefore the Gemara is suggesting is our Mishnah and the statement of Rabbi Gamliel are not repetitive. One is to validate her status, that if she says, the father of this baby is kosher, it validates her status, and therefore she could go ahead and marry a Kohen. And then ultimately, again, one is to go ahead and validate the status of her offspring, that is also fit for the kahuna. So Gemara says, Hani chalaman da'amar, l'divrei hamach shirba, posel babita. So we'll say, so that's fine according to the opinion that says that you could have like a split status. In other words, we'll say it could be that there is a school of thought that says a woman is believed regarding matters of herself, but not necessarily automatically believed regarding the status of her offspring, which is interesting. So the Gemara says, "Hani chaman damar hamach sheba posel babita, halman divrei hamach sheba mach shebita abashal my aslashminan." So we'll say, so again, if you go ahead and you could see this, we'll say you could see how the status of the mother and the status of the offspring are not necessarily linked. Right? They could be looked at in two different ways. So if you say that status of mother and status of offspring are not linked, now I understand why I need to state this halacha twice, once in our Mishnah of Abba Shaul and once of Rabbi Gamliel. But according to the opinion that says, let's say if halacha l'maisa you say that the status of mother and status of offspring are inherently linked. Therefore, if the mother is kosher, then what? The baby's kosher, then why do you have the need to state this halacha twice? To which the Gemara says, Abashal ma'aslash me'inan. So the Gemara says, Abashal adifa mid Rabbi Gamliel. Because the truth is, Abashal's statement is stronger than Rabbi Gamliel. Remember again, Abashal, just to clarify our statements, right? Abashal is the one who called the shtuki a beduki, right? And Abashal is teaching us that when a woman is pregnant and we don't know who the father is, we ask her, is the father kosher? And if she says yes, then what? Then halacha l'maisa we trust her. Rabbi Gamliel was saying a woman is pregnant. a woman is pregnant, and we ask her, what's the nature ultimately again of this child? She says the father is a Kohen. We believe her. To which the Gemara says, Abishal adi from the Gamaliel. Abishal is even shorter than Gamaliel. How so? Di mihasam hava mina hasam derov ksherin etzla. Because Rabbi say in the case of Rabbi Gamaliel, I would have thought that maybe this is a case of rov ksherim, where she lives in a place where the majority of men who she would come in contact were ksherim. Aval hechad derov psulin etzla emolo. But I will say maybe in a case where, let's say, the majority of men are psulim, maybe halacha lamaisa again she shouldn't be believed. Therefore, again, tzricha. So therefore, I will say, therefore, halacha lamaisa Abishol comes along and says that what, independent of whether or not the rove of men around her are ksherim or not, she is believed. She is believed. So in other words, I will say the Gemara is distinguishing. The Gemara is suggesting the case of Rabbi Gamliel could be a situation where a woman is pregnant. We ask her, who's the father? She says, oh, it's Ploni Akuza Kohen. So we believe her. It could be that's a case where Rov Ksherim, the majority of the men, let's say in her area, are genealogically fit. Okay, so now she comes along and says, the father of my baby is a kosher. We believe her. Why do we believe her? Why? She's supported by a Rov. She's supported by a Rov. But if she wasn't supported by a Rov, we wouldn't believe her. Comes along Abishol and says, no, even if she's not supported by a Rov, and she says, the father of my baby is a kosher, ultimately, again, she is believed. Okay, I'll say there's a lot of interesting halacha l'maisa on this as well about determining identity in these kind of cases. Shulchan Aruch brings down that maybe there's really two roves that are needed. Again, we're not going to delve into the intricacies of this, but fascinating. Says the Mishnah. Says the Shulchan, what is just fascinating to contemplate really is like this school of thought, this machlokes the Gemara just referenced, just to ponder a little bit. This fundamental machlokes about whether or not a mother's credibility automatically extends to her children or not. Now, the truth is, this is part of a much bigger machlokes, which is uber yerech imo, uber lav yerech imo, right? In general, how do you look at a fetus, right? Is a fetus just considered to be an extension of the mother or not an extension of the mother? I will say, and that has many, many, many different ramifications, right? But it's interesting, this is another application over here, where again, does the credibility of the mother automatically extend to the credibility of the fetus? And again, once again, that's a machlokas. So just fascinating to think about the relationship between the mother and the child in utero. Mishnah says as follows, Kol asurin lavo bekal, mutarin lavo zebazah. So as I said, back. Now remember again, this is the topic of our parak, right? Our parak is all about the different classes of yichus. So remember again, now the Mishnah makes a statement. Whoever is prohibited to come into the kal is permitted to marry one into the other, right? So we'll say, so whoever is not permitted to marry into the general marriage pool, those individuals are permitted to marry each other. Look at Rashi in the Mishnah. So Rashi says, Kol asrun lavo bekal mutran lavo zebazah kagon mamziri b'shtuki bi'afagav shezeh vade v'zeh safek. So we'll say, so for example, here's Mishnah's example. You have a mamzer, right? You have a mamzer, right? A mamzer is lo yavo bekal Hashem, and a shtuki, right? The shtuki also has limitations as to who he or she is permitted to marry. So therefore, according to the Tanna Kama, a mamzer is permitted to marry a shtuki. Now, Rashi does point out that even though they are very different, right? A mamzer and a shtuki are very different. How are they different? A mamzer is a vadai genealogical issue. What's the shtuki? Safek, right? Why is the shtuki a safek? Why? We don't know the father. In other words, maybe the shtuki is kosher, maybe the shtuki is not kosher. So Rashi points out that v'afagav shezeh ba'dev v'zeh safek v'ika l'meimar shu kosher. I'm reading Rashi. Afilu achi shar kilal afinu la'el b'kal vadai lo yavo aval b'kal safek yavo. So we'll say, so halacha l'maisa again. So therefore, anyone who is not permitted to marry into the general marriage pool, ultimately, again, they are permitted to marry each other. Okay, Rabbi Huda says it's aser. I will say it's not clear. You're going to see in the Gemara what's aser. So hold on to that. Rabbi Eliezer Omer vadon bevadon mutter. So I will say Rabbi Eliezer says no. Let's clarify this a little bit. Someone who is what we call a vadon. Vadon also means someone who has a definitive genealogical issue and therefore can't enter into the kal. Those individuals are permitted to marry each other, right? Let's read the rule, then we'll illustrate it. Vadon b'sveikan, but a vadai to a safek, or a sveikan b'vadon, or vice versa, or sveikan b'sveikan, or a safek to another safek, aser. Now I will say, so this is actually very interesting. So for example, the Gemara says, therefore, Rabbi Elazar says like this: who's allowed to marry each other? A vadai to a vadai. So for example, two mamzerim can marry each other, or like Rashi points out over here, a mamzer and a nesin, right? The nesinim, right? Those are vadai genealogical issues, and they are permitted to go ahead and marry each other. However, so let's go through the list. Vadan b'vadan mutter, vadan b'sveikan, but a vadai to a safek. So also, what's an example of a vadai to a safek? A mamzer to a shtuki, right? The mamzer to a shtuki. So ultimately, Rabbi Elazar would say, all right, that is aser. That is aser. Or sveikan b'sveikan. Rabbi Elazar said, it's actually interesting. According to Rabbi Elazar, one shtuki can't marry another shtuki. Rabbi Elazar said, now why not? Why can't you make a shtuki shidduch? Why not? Right? Why not? Because the L'maisa Rabbi Elazar say they're not necessarily the same. Because remember, shtuki, what's the shtuki status? What's the shtuki status? Right? Safek. So I'll say, just because you have two people who are shtukim doesn't mean they are the same. One of them could be problematic, and one of them could be totally fine. So we'll say it's incredible. So just to point out over here, so whereas you have the Tanakama, right? The Tanakama is holding anyone who has like a genealogical blemish which prevents unfettered access into the normal marriage pool, all those people are permitted to marry each other. Some mamzer to a shtuki, nesinim, all those can marry each other. Rabbi Huda says aser. We don't know what Rabbi Huda is talking about. Rabbi Eliezer says no. You can only marry someone essentially of the same genealogical status. Even that's not a totally true statement, right? Rabbi Yehuda essentially says, Rabbi Elazar says, only a vadai can marry a vadai. So essentially, a mamzer can marry a mamzer can marry a nasin, things like that. But any safek cases, they can't marry a vadai, so you can't have a shtuki marrying a mamzer, and you can't even have two shtukim marrying each other. Incredible. What are the examples of the safek cases? Shtuki, asufi, and kusi. So we'll say, so shtuki, remember again, shtuki, we don't know the father, right? Asufi, we don't know either of the parents, and kusi. We'll have to see exactly what kusi is. Kusi we haven't seen before. I will say, again, I should say, obviously we've seen kusi many times, but we haven't seen it actually in this discussion up until now about yichos. Take a quick look at Rashi, because Rashi here tells the story of the kusim. Rashi says, kusi, b'gemar mefarish mais vekayu. What's the safek of the kusim? The kusim osam shehoshev Sancheriv ba'arei shor. Remember again, I will say, Sancheriv, the king of Ashur, mixed up all the nations. He conquered, whenever he conquered a nation, he uprooted them from their indigenous land and resettled them somewhere else. So what happened? So Sancheriv went ahead and exiled the 10 tribes, right? And went ahead and settled in their area the people from the country of Kusa, hence the name Kusim. So he conquered Kusa, resettled the Kusim in Eretz Yisrael, and what happened? Kiddushin vayavo melech Ashur, right? Umakusa. Al shem sheviyim mikusa nikru kusim and iskairu me'emas harayos kiddushin vayishlach bamas harayos v'kula inyan b'mlach. So we'll say what happened. We know the story. We mentioned so many times. The Kusim living in Eretz Yisrael, there was an outbreak of lions because of their idolatrous practices. They converted. Let's say so again. The Gemara says Kusim gere arayos. They converted because of the lions. Now both say the problem was just over time they were found not to be genuine in their Judaic practice and commitment. So therefore, again, there's like a little bit of like a cloud of doubt that is cast over the nature of their conversions. Okay, so that's Kusim suffix. So we'll say, so let's analyze. My kal asrun lavo bakal. So we'll say when the Mishnah says anyone who is usher to come into the Kal Hashem, what is that? Who are they talking about? Ilema, Mamziri, Nesini, Shtuki, Asufi. If that's what you're talking about, that whole list, Hatana Resha, Mamziri, Unesini, Shtuki, Vasufi, Mutarm, Level Zebazah. We'll say, here's the issue. The issue is the first Mishnah in this parak told us that whoever has essentially a genealogical issue and therefore doesn't have unfettered access into the Kal Hashem are all permitted to marry each other. We already learned this in the opening Mishnah of the parak. To which the Gemara says, "V'su Rabbi Huda oser ahiyah." When Rabbi Huda says it's asr, what is he referring to? Ilema avadon b'sveikan. So we'll say if Rabbi Huda is referring to a vadai marrying a safek. So for example, Rabbi Huda is saying. So we'll say, whereas the Tanakama says, for example, you could have a vadai marrying a safek. What's the case of Vadai marrying a Safek? A Mamzer marrying a Shtuki. Tanakama says that's mutter. And is Rabbi Yehuda coming along and saying ultimately again that a Mamzer can't marry a Shtuki? Is that what he's saying, that a Vadai can't marry a Safek? Here's the problem with this. Hamidiktani Seifa, Rabbi Eliezer Omer Vadan bevadan mutter, Vadan bisveikan, usveikan bisveikan asar. Rabbi Eliezer is saying that only a Vadai can marry a Vadai, but a Vadai can't marry a Safek, and even Sveikos can't marry each other. Mechlad Rabbi Yehuda lo sirale. So we'll say Rabbi Yehuda is a different opinion, which means Rabbi Yehuda doesn't subscribe to that idea. So we'll say, so what we're just trying to figure out is when the Mishnah says Rabbi Yehuda oser, that Rabbi Yehuda is saying that it's aser, what is he referring to? What is he talking about? V'chi tema, Rabbi Yehuda oser ager b'mamzeres. So remember, so maybe Rabbi Yehuda is coming along and saying something specific. He's saying a ger can't marry a mamzeres. Remember, we had this machlokes yesterday. Maybe he's weighing in on this and saying that a ger can't marry a mamzeres, to which the Gemara says, Midi ger mamzeres katani. The Mishnah is not talking about that. Right? That's not the topic in the Mishnah. Kol asurun lava bakal katani. We'll say ultimately again, the Mishnah talks about anyone who is not permitted to marry into the general assembly of the Jewish people. So Rabbi Yehuda, we'll say on base, Rabbi Yehuda, hachi ka'amar. This is what Rabbi Yehuda means to say. Rabbi says, so now remember again, we are trying to figure out when Rabbi Yehuda says in the Mishnah, that halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Yehuda oser, Rabbi Yehuda answers, what is he referring to? To which the Gemara says, watch this. Hachi kamar, kol asurin lava bekal kahuna. No, Rabbi Yehuda says like this: whoever is usher to come into the community of kohanim. Now I'll say, now what does this mean? Who is prohibited to come into the community of kohanim? Ma'ininu Giores pechusa mibas shalosh shanim v'yom echad. Wow. So we're saying Rabbi Yehuda's worldview. Who does this apply to? Even a girl who converts below the age of 3 years old in one day. Now we'll say, if you remember again, let's take a look at Rashi just a moment. Hachi Kamar first. Rashi Kilomar. Leolan Rabbi Yehuda ager mamzeres kai the shamlei l'tanakama da ariba. V'hai bekal de ka'amrit kal kohunahu to koin aser begioras afilu pechusa mibas gimel shanim delav bas biahi ve'ein sham mishum chashash znos. Now watch this. The Gemara is suggesting as follows. Rabbi Yehuda actually is switching gears a little bit, and when Rabbi Yehuda says aser, Rabbi Yehuda means to say like this: that ultimately, again, we're talking about those who are prohibited to come into the kal of kahuna, the Kohana community. Now I will say, but we already know who's prohibited to come into the Kohana community. Rabbi Yehuda is coming to advance a unique case, which is, we know that a Kohen is not allowed to marry Gioras. Kohen is not allowed to marry a convert. What happens if you have a girl who converted below the age of 3 years old? Rabbi say, now remember again, the halacha is that bia is not recognized in a girl less than 3 years old one day. Again, one of these strange halachas, a little bit hard to wrap our head around this, that apparently above the age of 3 it is recognized as an act, but lamaisa, below the age of 3 it is not. So I would have thought like this: if you have a girl who converts below the age of 3, she should really be fit for a Kohen, right? Because lamaisa, again, there's no possibility of any type of bia that would render her a zona that would prevent her from marrying a Kohen. But yet Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, he adds in, no, any giores, even a girl below the age of 3 years old in one day, is not permitted to marry a Kohen. So the Gemara says, Udulok Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and this is not like Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. What does Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai say? The Gemara says, look at Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and not because Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, because we're going to see Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai holds that halacha l'maisa, a girl who converts below the age of 3 is actually permitted to marry a Kohen. So not like that. So the Gemara says, okay, mutar and lavo zebazeh. So ultimately, again, these groups are permitted to go ahead and marry into each other. So I'll say, so just understand, what is Rabbi Yehuda saying? Rabbi Yehuda is saying is like this: any people who can't marry into the kal of kahuna, who can't marry kohanim, they can't marry kohanim, but what? They can marry each other. So this is a new klal. Beforehand, the Tanakama was saying, whoever can't enter into the kal Hashem is permitted to marry each other. So the Tanakama holds that a mamzer can marry a shtuki, and a sin can marry a shtuki, and a shtuki can marry mamzer. All these different cases. Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, no, that's not the klal. That's not the klal. The klal is, anyone who cannot marry into the community of kahuna, those individuals are permitted to marry each other. So, for example, I will say what that would mean is a girl who converted below the age of 3 can't marry into the kahuna, but she can marry a mamzeres or mamzer, right? Or she can marry a shtuki. That's Rabbi Huda's principle. So the Gemara says, "Benukma bebashol shalom v'yomechad v'afil Rabbi Shimon Yochai." But why not set this up as a case? We're talking about a gioris, a girl who converted above the age of 3 years old in one day. And halacha l'mai said, then you could have it in accordance with everyone. To which the Gemara says, mitzida tavra. The answer to that is really on its side. It's really right by the question. Because then you would say, the reason she could go out and marry is because, again, she's above the, or she can't marry, is because she's above the age of 3 years old in one day. Asura lavo zebazeh. You would say based on that, if she converted above the age, below the age of 3 years old in one day, whereby inference then she would be permitted to marry into the kal kahuna, she would be prohibited to marry these other individuals. So I will say, Hare pechusa mibash shaloshon v'yom echad, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, timuteres lavo bakal kahuna, umuteres lavo zebazeh. Shabbos say, here's the problem. That would totally destroy the principle. Because Shabbos say, according to Rabbi Shmuel bar Yochai, you could have a situation of a girl who converted below the age of 3 years old in one day, where technically she's permitted to marry into the kahuna, right? Because there's no issue of some type of bia which would have disqualified her. But yet, that very same girl is also permitted to marry who? Other individuals who are of pasal lineage, are psulim. Why? Because she's still a gioris. She's still a gioris. Rabbi say he would have therefore a case of a girl who is permitted to marry into the kal kahuna, but is also permitted to marry into the group of psulim. That would destroy the principle. Remember again, Rabbi Huda is trying to advance the principle. I'll say, what's his principle? So Rabbi say, what are we trying to do? Right? What is halacha all about? What is halacha all about? Halacha is about creating rules, right? And then therefore those rules ultimately again create groupings under them. So we're trying to create a rule. What's the Tanakhama's rule? Tanakhama's rule is, if you are genealogically blemished and therefore unable to go ahead and marry into Kal Hashem, here's the good news. What's the good news? You can marry each other. Rabbi Yehuda says, that's not the rule. That's not the rule. The rule is, anyone who can't marry into the kahuna, anyone who's like that, all those people, you can marry each other. So we're just trying to figure out, what specific case is Rabbi Yehuda coming to add on? Shabbos said there is an interesting case. What case is coming to add on? The girl who converts under the age of 3. Because there is a whole school of thought that a girl who converts under the age of 3 is permitted to marry into the kuna, even though she's a giores. Why? Because there's no fear of any type of disqualifying bia. So the Gemara says, fine. So let's analyze this. So this is Rabbi Yehuda's principle. Anyone who can't marry into the kahuna, ultimately, again, those people are permitted to marry each other. The Gemara says, does that rule actually work? Let's look at this. Is that true? So let's analyze this. Anyone who's not permitted to marry into the kahuna, they are permitted to marry each other. So the Gemara says, V'hari amana, ugrusha, chalala, v'zona, da'asurim laval b'kahuna. So I'll say, let's analyze this. You have a woman who's a grusha, a divorcee. So she's not permitted to marry into the kahuna. I will say, is she permitted to marry a mamzer? Is she permitted to marry a mamzer? No. She's the Israelis, right? She's a regular Jewess. Okay, she can't marry a kahuna, or she can't marry a Kohen. Or a woman is a widow, so she can't marry a Kohen Gadol. So she can't enter, so these people, right, Chalala, Zona, these people, they can't marry into the kahuna, but they're not allowed to marry a mamzer. So you see the principle doesn't work. Furthermore, ha mutter aser. And again, furthermore, this idea that if you are permitted to marry a Kohen, you can't marry one of the psulim, that's not necessarily true. V'hari ger shemuter b'kohanes umuter b'mamzer. So we'll say, again, another exception to this rule is a ger. A ger, we'll say, remember again, we saw this in yesterday's daf, this was the famous shir in Mechuzah, right? A ger, ultimately, again, could actually go to both extremes, right? The ger, the convert, can't marry a Kohen, but a ger can marry a kohenes and also can marry a mamzeres. The point the Gemara is just making is, Rabbi Huda, your rule is not true. It's not true. This is what it means to say. Kol shekohen asr li says bito, any case where a kohen could not marry the daughter of a particular union. Umaynihu, what's an example? Ger shena segiores. So I will say, so ultimately again, And so essentially, we're modifying the rule. The rule is, Rabbi Yehuda's rule is, any case where the Kohen could not marry the offspring of a particular union, those individuals are permitted to marry each other. So what's the example of a Kohen not being permitted to marry the offspring of a union? A ger who marries a giora. So I will say this is a whole discussion as well. So you have parents who converted, but their child didn't convert. A child was born Jewish. There's a concept that that child should not marry a Kohen. Again, we'll discuss this in greater depth. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, ultimately, again, mutarin level zebazeh. Supposed to say, again, a ger who marries a giores, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov holds the offspring of that union is usher to the kahuna. So that would be the example. So we'll say any case where ultimately, again, the Kohen could not marry the daughter of a particular union, any of those individuals are permitted to marry each other. So Rav says, is that true? Uklalahu, the kol shekoin asra lisas bito mutarin level zebazeh. So you're telling me, any case where the Kohen couldn't marry the offspring of a particular union, those individuals are permitted to marry each other. Is that true? The Gemara says, Hari chalal shenasa bas Yisrael. What about a chalal? So who's the chalal? Chalal is the offspring of a prohibited Kohanic union. So for example, a Kohen marries a grusha, they have a child. That child is a chalal. Now chalal, we'll call him chalal, marries a Yisraelis. So what's the halacha? The Kohen asra lisa bito. The Kohen is not permitted to marry the daughter of a chalal and a Yisraelis. Vasurin nami lavo zebazeh. But that offspring ultimately again can't marry a mamzer or someone else. Lo kasha kirit Rabbi Dostai ben Yehuda. Rabbi say that's not a kasha because why? Because our Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Dostai, and Rabbi Dostai in general holds that when a chalal marries a Yisraelis, the offspring is totally genealogically pure. Okay, v'hari chalal shenasa chalala. So we'll say, what about the case of a chalal who marries a chalala? The Kohen asra li sabita. So we'll say, here's a case of where the Kohen can't marry the offspring, right? So now we'll say, we're suggesting that now the rule of Rabbi Yehuda is any time that the Kohen can't marry the offspring of a particular union, any people like that, they are permitted to marry within the assembly of psulim. Okay, so let's take a look at this, see if this rule is true. Chalal marries a chalala. Chalal marries a chalala. So I'll say the offspring is prohibited to a Kohen. Fine. Va'asr nami lavo zebozeh. Now we'll say, now still, the offspring of that union, right? A chalal has a child with a chalala. That child can't marry a mamzer. Child can marry a mamzer. Visu. Furthermore, hamutar aser. It's not mutar, it's asr. Hari ger shenasa bas Yisrael. What about a case of a ger who marries a bas Yisrael? The Kohen mutar lisa bito. The Kohen is permitted to marry the offspring of that union. Umutar and lavo zebazeh. But yet again, the offspring of that union could still go ahead, right, and ultimately marry into the psulim. So Rabbi said the point over here is, you see, Rabbi Yehuda's rule doesn't work. It doesn't work. In other words, it's not true that if you can't marry, right, any case, in other words, we wanted to say any case where the Kohen couldn't marry the daughter of a particular union, any people like that, so to speak, can marry each other. Marry each other meaning that they can marry into the community of psulim. But it's not true. Hacha, mamzer me'achoso umamzer me'achos isha ikimenah. All right, so now watch this. Watch this. So now the Gemara is totally reframing the machlokes. You're right. The machlokes will say that's something else. The machlokes is, what is the definition of a mamzer? What is the definition of a mamzer? Or to say a little bit differently, what type of prohibited relationships create mamzerus? So we'll say, here's the machlokes. Mamzer me'achoso, mamzer. Let me just at least start this. So we'll say, if you look at Rashi, Rashi is mamzer me'achoso, krisos. Mamzer me'achosisha, misos. So we'll say, here's the shaila. We know that a mamzer is a result, ultimately, again, of a forbidden relationship. The shaila is it any forbidden relationship? Whether that relationship is punishable by kares or misas bezin. So, for example, a man has a child with his sister, so that ultimately is a chi of kares. A man has a child with a married woman, that's a chi of misas bezdin. So the shaila, the machlokes is going to be, do both of those unions create mamzer? So we're going to stop over here for today. We'll pick up with this again tomorrow, but just understand where we're leaving off. So we'll say, remember again, what are we trying to do? We're trying to create rules. We're trying to create principles. We're trying to create categories. So the Tanakhama's rule is, anytime you have anyone who is in the group of people who cannot freely marry into the general assembly of Klal Yisrael, all of those people are permitted to marry each other. Rabbi Yehuda is espousing a different rule. So at first we thought that Rabbi Yehuda was saying that Allah Lamaisa, anytime you can't marry into the kahuna, you can marry any psulim. That we disproved that rule. Then we thought Rabbi Yehuda is saying anytime a Kohen can't marry the daughter of a particular union, those individuals can marry into the psulim. We disproved that rule. So we'll pick up tomorrow, Meretz Hashem, with the third attempt to try to figure out what is the rule of Rabbi Huda. We'll say, Shkoyach.